In a climate-controlled laboratory in Jerusalem, a piece of parchment smaller than a postage stamp is sitting under a lens that can see light the human eye was never built to detect. For 70 years, this fragment was catalogued as blank. Nothing there. Empty leather. Then a camera built for reading the surface of Mars was pointed at it instead, and a handful of letters that had been invisible since the reign of the Roman emperors began to appear on a screen in a laboratory. Somewhere in a small circle of scholars working under strict confidentiality, there is now a debate over whether one of those fragments contains something that has never turned up in 78 years of studying the Dead Sea Scrolls, an actual name, tied to an actual person, sitting inside a manuscript tradition that historians have spent decades trying and failing to attach to real history. If the reading holds up, it will not just fill in a missing word. It could reshape who we think wrote some of the most important religious texts ever recovered. And why? To understand why a single possible name is generating this much quiet excitement among specialists, you have to go back to where this whole story began. Because the Dead Sea Scrolls have always had a strange relationship with luck. In the spring of 1947, a Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad ed-Dib was looking for a stray goat in the limestone cliffs above the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea, in what was then British Mandate Palestine. He tossed a rock into a cave opening, more out of idle curiosity than anything else, and heard something break. What had shattered was a sealed clay jar, and inside it were leather scrolls that had been sitting undisturbed since roughly the time of Jesus. Over the following decade, archaeologists and local scavengers combed 11 caves near the ruins of Qumran and pulled out roughly 25,000 fragments of leather, papyrus, and parchment, the shredded remains of nearly 900 separate manuscripts written in Hebrew, Aramaic, and Greek. Among them were the oldest surviving copies of the Hebrew Bible by roughly 1,000 years, along with texts nobody had ever heard of before, community law codes, prophetic commentary, hymns, calendars, and what appears to be the surviving library of a religious community that vanished when Rome crushed the Jewish revolt in 70 AD. That discovery, born from a badly aimed rock, permanently changed the study of both Judaism and early Christianity. Before 1947, the oldest complete Hebrew Bible manuscript scholars had access to dated to around the 9th and 10th centuries AD. That left a gap of more than 1,000 years between when the biblical books were actually written and the oldest copies anyone could examine. Nobody could say with certainty how much the text had drifted during that stretch of time. Then researchers unrolled the Great Isaiah Scroll from Cave 1, a complete copy of the book of Isaiah roughly 1,000 years older than anything previously known, and found a text that was, in its essentials, remarkably close to the version already in use. There were spelling differences and small variants, but the core content had survived the journey largely intact. That single scroll told scholars something they had never been able to verify before, that the scribal culture behind the Hebrew Bible had preserved its texts with real discipline across centuries of hand copying. But biblical manuscripts were only a portion of what came out of those caves. Most of the material was sectarian, meaning it belonged to a specific religious community rather than to mainstream Jewish scripture. There is a text called the Community Rule, which laid out the internal structure, rituals, and worldview of a group that referred to itself as the Sons of Light and believed it was living through the final countdown to a cosmic war between good and evil. There was the War Scroll, essentially a battle plan for that apocalyptic conflict. And there was a commentary on the biblical book of Habakkuk that reinterpreted ancient prophecy as coded references to real people and real events, including a mysterious figure called the Teacher of Righteousness, who led the community, and an opposing figure called the Wicked Priest, who persecuted him. These weren't abstract theological essays. They read like the internal documents of an actual group of people, wrestling with actual conflict. And that raised an obvious question that scholars have never been able to definitively answer. Who were these people? And who exactly were the men behind those two titles? For most of the last 70 years, one theory dominated the field. Roland de Vaux, the French priest who led the original excavation of the Qumran ruins in the 1950s, argued that the scrolls belonged to a Jewish sect called the Essenes, a group described by ancient writers like Josephus and Philo as ascetic, communal, and deliberately separated from mainstream Jewish life. The theory fit neatly. The community rule sounded like descriptions of Essene practice. The ruins at Qumran looked like they could house a communal religious settlement. The Romans destroyed the site during the Jewish revolt, which would explain why the scrolls were hidden and never retrieved. For a long time, this became the textbook answer, taught in universities and repeated in documentaries. But the cracks showed up almost immediately once scholars started reading more closely. Some scrolls seemed to contradict positions laid out in the community rule. Different manuscripts appeared to come from different scribal hands, different time periods, and sometimes conflicting theological viewpoints, which is a strange thing to find in the supposed library of a single, tightly organized sect. Alternative theories followed. One historian argued the scrolls weren't a sectarian library at all, but a collection of manuscripts smuggled out of multiple Jerusalem libraries by refugees fleeing the Roman siege, which would explain the diversity far better than a single community would. Others suggested the texts leaned closer to Sadducean theology than Essene belief, or questioned whether the Qumran settlement was even religious in nature, proposing instead that it might have been a pottery workshop, a villa, or a military outpost. None of these debates have ever been fully resolved, because the physical evidence itself simply hasn't been detailed enough to settle them. That's what has changed in the last several years, and it's why old fragments are suddenly producing new headlines. The transformation started with imaging technology. For most of the 20th century, scholars worked from black and white photographs taken in the 1950s and 1960s, images that captured whatever was visible to the naked eye and nothing beyond that. Multispectral imaging works completely differently. It captures light across a range of wavelengths, from ultraviolet through near-infrared, well outside what human vision can register. Different wavelengths interact differently with the chemical compounds in ancient ink and parchment, which means text that has faded into total invisibility under normal light can suddenly become legible under infrared. The Israel Antiquities Authority, working with imaging specialists including teams connected to NASA and Google, began systematically rephotographing the entire scroll collection using this technology in the early 2010s. And the results are now publicly viewable through the Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls digital library. But imaging alone wasn't enough. Reading ancient Hebrew script is difficult under the best conditions. Handwriting styles shifted across centuries. Individual scribes had their own quirks, and centuries of damage and decay have left many characters ambiguous even to trained eyes. Traditional paleography, the study of historical handwriting, depended on human specialists who had spent decades training themselves to recognize subtle letter forms, and that kind of expertise is slow to build and limited in supply. That's where artificial intelligence entered the picture. Researchers at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands, led by a scholar named Mladen Popovic, spent years building a machine learning system trained specifically on the handwriting found across the scroll collection. The system, which the team nicknamed after the biblical figure Enoch, learned to recognize individual scribal hands, detect statistical patterns across thousands of fragments, and flag connections a human researcher scanning one scroll at a time might never notice, like two supposedly unrelated fragments actually being written by the same scribe. On its own, that would already be a major research tool. Combined with a third breakthrough, dramatically improved radiocarbon dating that requires only a tiny sample instead of destroying a meaningful portion of a fragment, it became something more powerful, a way to cross-check handwriting analysis against physical, chemical evidence of a manuscript's age, without sacrificing the manuscript itself. The results started arriving in stages. In 2018, the Israel Antiquities Authority announced that dozens of fragments long catalogued simply as blank had turned out to contain readable text once multispectral imaging was applied, ranging from biblical passages to previously unknown sectarian material. It was a preview of what was coming. In June of 2025, Popovic and his colleagues published a study that combined the AI handwriting analysis with fresh radiocarbon testing across a significant portion of the collection, and the findings rattled the field. A number of manuscripts that had been confidently dated using paleographic methods developed back in the 1960s turned out to be substantially older than anyone had assumed. That's not a minor technical correction. If a manuscript is older than previously believed, the historical context surrounding its composition shifts along with it. Events, conflicts, and figures that scholars assumed a text was reacting to may no longer line up chronologically, which means entire interpretive frameworks built around those assumptions need to be reconsidered. It's against that backdrop that the renewed attention to the teacher of righteousness and the wicked priest has picked up momentum again. Various historical candidates have been floated for these two figures over the decades. Some scholars have pointed to Onias III, a high priest deposed in the 2nd century BC, or his son Onias IV, who fled to Egypt afterward. Others have proposed obscure figures from the Maccabean period whose full identities were never fully documented. None of these theories has ever gained the kind of solid evidentiary backing needed to settle the debate, and the same has been true for candidates proposed for the wicked priest, ranging from various Maccabean-era leaders to the high priest Hyrcanus II. What researchers working on newly legible fragments are now reporting, cautiously and without full publication yet, is that at least one previously unreadable piece of parchment appears to reference a specific historical individual in a context that no other surviving source from that period documents. It's important to be precise about where this actually stands. The findings have not been fully published. They are still moving through peer review, and the scholars involved have been notably careful in public statements, aware that dramatic early claims in this field have collapsed under scrutiny before. But if the identification eventually holds, it would be the first time a scroll fragment has offered an explicit link between the Qumran community and the broader political and religious conflicts documented elsewhere in the historical record. It would mean the teacher of righteousness could finally have a real name attached to a real historical moment, rather than remaining a symbolic figure debated purely through internal textual clues. Any claim of this scale in Dead Sea Scrolls research now has to survive a much higher bar of scrutiny than it once did, and there's a specific reason for that. In 2020, the Museum of the Bible in Washington, D.C. admitted that all 16 of the Dead Sea Scroll fragments it had purchased and proudly displayed were modern forgeries, despite having been examined by scholars who failed to catch the deception before the museum spent millions of dollars acquiring them. It was an embarrassing episode for everyone involved, but it also forced the field to tighten its standards considerably. Chemical testing of ink and parchment, radiocarbon verification, and multispectral imaging capable of revealing anachronistic materials invisible to the naked eye are now treated as baseline requirements before any new claim is taken seriously. The fragments currently being reanalyzed under this new technological approach have already passed those tests. They aren't recent discoveries surfacing from questionable private sources. They're materials excavated from the Judean desert caves back in the 1940s and 1950s, cataloged by the original archaeological teams, and stored in controlled facilities for decades. In many cases, they're simply fragments the original scholars gave up on, too faded to photograph properly, too damaged to read with the tools available at the time, filed away and largely forgotten. What's changed isn't the material. It's the technology now capable of reading it. The Judean desert has also kept producing new material through ongoing survey work that has nothing to do with laboratory analysis. Since the 1990s, the Israeli Civil Administration has been systematically surveying hundreds of caves throughout the region, partly out of scholarly interest, and partly to get ahead of looters who continue to sell scroll fragments on the antiquities black market for enormous sums. In 2021, that survey work produced one of the most significant finds since the original 1940s and 1950s excavations. Additional fragments of a Greek translation of the 12 Minor Prophets, recovered from caves in the Nahal Hever region south of Qumran and dated to roughly the 1st or 2nd century AD. These fragments represent a different textual tradition entirely from the Hebrew scrolls found at Qumran, underscoring just how varied Jewish scriptural practice actually was during this period. Other caves in these surveys have turned up sandals, combs, coins, and human remains, small physical details that add texture to the human story behind the texts, even when they don't directly advance the identity debates. And then there's the strangest object in the entire collection, one that the new technology has also been turned toward: Unlike the rest of the scrolls, which are leather or papyrus, the copper scroll, catalogued as 3Q15, was engraved onto thin sheets of metal that were rolled into a cylinder rather than written on parchment. Its contents are a list of locations where enormous quantities of treasure, gold, silver, and other valuables are supposedly buried, described in terms that suggest wealth far beyond what any single small community could plausibly have owned. Theories about what it actually represents have ranged widely. Perhaps it records the hidden treasury of the Jerusalem temple, evacuated ahead of Rome's destruction of the city. Perhaps it's a work of fiction with no basis in real events. Or perhaps the locations are coded rather than literal. Nobody has ever found the treasure, and the sites described have never been conclusively pinpointed. But multispectral imaging and AI analysis have been applied here too, recovering characters that had been obscured by corrosion for 2,000 years. The new readings haven't cracked the mystery, but they've clarified the text enough that more precise identification of the described locations may eventually be possible. What all of this adds up to is a simple but genuinely surprising fact. The Dead Sea Scrolls, one of the most intensively studied archaeological discoveries of the last century, are not a closed case. For decades, the working assumption in the field was that everything readable had already been read, every fragment translated, every major question at least mapped out even if not resolved. That assumption turned out to be wrong. Fragments long filed away as blank are yielding legible text. Manuscripts confidently dated by mid-20th century methods are being reassigned to earlier periods. Names that scholars assumed were lost to history forever are, in at least one case under careful review, potentially being recovered. None of it erases the genuine uncertainty that still surrounds the scrolls, and reputable researchers are being deliberately cautious about overstating what a single fragment can prove. But the direction of travel is clear. The scrolls were sealed in those caves roughly 2,000 years ago by people who almost certainly expected to come back for them. They never got the chance. Jerusalem fell, the revolt was crushed, and whoever this community was, they were scattered or killed, leaving their entire library behind in the dark, preserved only by the dry desert air. A shepherd's badly aimed rock brought that library back into the world in 1947, nearly 8 decades later. With tools nobody in that generation could have imagined, we are still learning what's actually written on those pages, and it turns out there's considerably more to find than anyone thought.